not right. Okay. All right, I think it's time for us to start. Are we good to go, Rick? Yeah, okay. And I detect something odd with the slides here, so I don't know what's going on with that. We'll find out. Okay, good to see everybody. I know we've got folks out of town this morning, and we're good to have all of you. We're studying in the Gospel of John, and as I say here, usually I've got my schedule, but now I've got this. So I guess we'll take it in the order it comes. And I'm the one that loaded the slides on there. So I guess if it's messed up, I'm the one. So I'm going to go with what the slides are. This was part of the review. Last time we talked in the Gospel of John about the ministry of Jesus. And one of the points that's interesting is that from John's Gospel, we probably get a better idea of the chronological flow based on John's giving us some information about the different feast days. So to look at this, and as I say, this slide is out of place. I would have had it later in the review. But we've got a first Passover that we will notice today in chapter 2, where it says Jesus was in Jerusalem during the Passover. And as I noted last week, it's of interest to us that in John's gospel, John focuses more on Jesus being in and around Jerusalem than do the other gospel accounts. And there may be different reasons for that. Collie mentioned to me afterwards, maybe it's because of the controversy that was going on at the time that the gospel was written, and maybe John is addressing some of that. The Holy Spirit through John is addressing that. Whatever the reason, we will find as we go through that a lot of the action takes place in Jerusalem. And that's not true of the other Gospels. The other Gospel accounts tell us about Jesus being up in Galilee most of the time. At any rate, here's the first Passover in chapter 2. There is a feast mentioned in chapter 5, which may well be a second Passover. So it's somewhat speculation. There's obviously a good possibility that this feast he mentions could be a Passover feast. He doesn't name it. And he names other feasts that take place. We'll see that as we go through. But if this is a second Passover, then obviously we've got a year that has passed. In chapter 6, we have the Passover being mentioned again at the time that Jesus feeds the 5,000. So this, we're pretty sure, is during the last year of Jesus' ministry. And so here is this Passover in chapter 6. Again, the other writers, this is one miracle that the other writers mention, the feeding of the 5,000, but they don't tell us necessarily when it takes place. So John fills in that blank for us, saying that this feast was at hand. And then, of course, the final Passover when Jesus is put to death after going up to Jerusalem with his apostles for the Passover. So if you add in the years between those, you get 3 years. And then we noticed in chapter 1 last time that there is this period of time before that first Passover. So at least 3+ years if this is the right chronology. Does that make any difference in the scheme of things? Probably not. Was it 2 years? Was it 3 years? Apparently that wasn't the most important thing for us to have in terms of detail. But if you ever wonder when someone says a 3-year ministry, how you get that number, this would at least account for some of that. Okay, we talked about the prologue, the first 18 verses. John gives us an overview of the themes that he will be emphasizing as he goes through his account. He talks about Jesus as the Word, the Logos. We talked about that term last time. And it was a word that had been used in the language to mean a number of different things. The term word had been used in the Old Testament, not the Greek term logos, but the word translated word, devar, in the Old Testament. And of course, it had a great meaning because God's word had caused the creation of the universe. God had revealed himself through his word, and he had accomplished many miracles through his word. So all those things were a part of that. And then Jesus was revealed and made flesh, verse 14. We're going to see the emphasis on that today and how that theme might be developed as the gospel proceeds. And then it's possible that maybe the emphasis is on that middle section, verses 12 and 13, where he gave the right to those who received him to become children of God. And someone pointed out to me, which I probably did emphasize a couple of weeks ago, that that's giving someone the right to become a child of God. So at any rate, we've got those themes that are described there. All right, so we'll go on to chapter 2. And in this chapter, it's a fairly short chapter. We've got a couple of different things that take place. The first is that first sign that Jesus works where he turns water to wine. And then the second part of the chapter deals with his cleansing of the temple, verses 13 to 25. So we'll look at each of those. All right, any comments before we go on? Any thoughts about anything up to this point? Chapter 1, we didn't review the latter portion of the chapter where Jesus interacts with different disciples, and by the end of that chapter, there are disciples seeking him and following him and ready to go with him, and that's kind of where the action picks up then in chapter 2. All right, so let's go ahead and look at that chapter. So in chapter 2, it says, on the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. So here is a wedding that's taking place in Cana, and so geographically we have shifted from somewhere to the south. Now, we're told that John was baptizing out in the wilderness, and there is some speculation as to exactly where that location might have been. Some have said this area just north of the Dead Sea, where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, is a possibility. Others have said maybe it's that area up there, Salim, Anon. It might be up a little bit further north, but that's where John would have been preaching and baptizing and people coming out to see him. So wherever it was, Jesus goes from there back up north. And this particular instance is in Cana of Galilee. Now, of course, where was Jesus from? He was from Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, but they settled in Nazareth. And then where does he make his headquarters as he develops his ministry? What's the place that's usually connected with his headquarters or his place of operation, at least up north? Yeah, all right. Yeah, Capernaum, right there next to the Sea of Galilee. So this takes place in Cana, and Canaan is southwest from Capernaum. It's north of Nazareth. But on this occasion, it says that there is a wedding at Cana. So Jesus has made it back up north to Galilee. And this is a picture of an area that might be those areas where John was baptizing. And then this is a picture of one excavated site that is possibly thought to be this village or town of Cana. And you can see there it's up in the hills. It's not right next to the Sea of Galilee, but that site has been excavated. So just give you some idea of what the landscape might have been like, where Jesus and the disciples are traveling up there north in Galilee. So we're told that at this wedding, Jesus' mother was there. And that's of interest to us. The only other time in John's gospel where Jesus' mother is mentioned is chapter 19, at the end of the gospel. And it is at the cross, and you'll remember there, here are these women who are gathered around the cross, and it mentions Jesus' mother, not by name, but just says his mother and his mother's sister, whose name was Mary, the wife of Clopas, and then Mary Magdalene. And what happens there is that when Jesus saw his mother, and then notice the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." So that's kind of interesting, and we can discuss that when we get to chapter 19, which will be in a little while, but you've got Jesus indicating to this disciple that he wants this disciple to take care of his mother. That seems to be what he is indicating there. And it says, from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. So even at the point of death, Jesus is concerned about her welfare. And he must have been going through extreme suffering even at this point, and yet has the presence of mind to make this request or to ask this disciple to do that. What's of interest to us is, A, that she appears here, as well as at the beginning of the account, and the manner in which he speaks to her. "Woman, behold your son." So we'll notice what happens here at the wedding feast. Jesus is invited to the wedding with his disciples. Now, we're not giving all the details about everything that happens here. We're left to speculate as to what may or may not have been the case. What do you imagine about what we are told here as far as this occasion? Anything else that we might determine about the situation? Okay, all right. Okay, so it's going to be the first sign that's worked. This is the first sign that John acknowledges here and says that he worked. And yes, she has an expectation, so we'll talk about that. Do Jesus and the disciples crash the party here? Are they? No, they're invited. And she seems to have something to do with it because she does make a request concerning the amount of wine that is there to serve. All of which might suggest what? You know, if you're helping to run the wedding, that maybe suggests that you've got something to do with who's involved. Now, we're not told any of that. And in one sense, it doesn't matter. But that's simply to say that they seem to have made a point to attend this wedding feast. And we'll pursue this in a moment, but what about a wedding in that time? Any importance attached to weddings? Pardon me? Yes, okay. It was a big deal. I think that's exactly right. In fact, probably a bigger deal than what we think of. Now, weddings are a big deal today. They certainly are. To have a wedding ceremony, to invite guests to that, you know, sometimes a wedding is such that you want to know if I was one of the ones invited, and who was invited, and who wasn't invited. But that's because it's an important occasion. And why is it such an important occasion? I know these are kind of elementary questions, but what's important about a wedding? It's kind of the building block of what the organization of society is about, according to God. He intends for a man and woman to marry. Now, we don't read anything about wedding ceremonies as such, as far as ordaining what the wedding ceremony has to be like. But this is an important event. In fact, very important. I think people still acknowledge that today when they have a wedding. Unfortunately, it's often after people have been living together for many years, at least our culture kind of treats it that way, but there still seems to be some importance attached to that. Well, from God's vantage point, it's very important that this unit is being formed, this family is being formed, a husband and a wife are coming together. So it is a special occasion. It's an important occasion. And it serves as the first sign that Jesus works, that this takes place in this setting. Okay. So that's maybe good for us just to think about that a little bit. You know, yeah, it's a wedding. Okay, what's a wedding? Well, we've been to weddings, but it's something important that's taking place. And so when Jesus is there, his mother says to him, they have no wine. And we're told earlier, the wine ran out, which sets up this exchange. Jesus speaking to her, he says, woman, what does this have to do with me? So I said abrupt, not rude. What do you think? Does this sound like a son speaking to his mother? Okay, all right. Maybe not the way we would do that, but yeah, that's the same way that we just saw he addressed her at the cross. Ed, what were you going to? Okay. Any other comments about that? I mean, to our ears, you know, to say woman sounds very generic, maybe not very concerned. And there have been a lot of questions raised about this. You know, why would Jesus speak this way to his mother? She wasn't offended, Ray says. Okay, so that's important for us to note.
For us today, that would be an insult. Like, if Ray were to say to me, woman, it would be because he's irritated with me.
Okay.
But that's a cultural thing we have.
Okay.
Not
all right.
press them on that.
Yeah, so we have to take into account the way in which they would have spoken, the terminology that they would have used. It might be different than ours for sure. Now, he goes on to say, what does this have to do with me? And from the comments that I read, it suggests that, yeah, maybe this is a little abrupt. You know, you wouldn't necessarily expect this. But he's not shaming her or something like this. He's not being rude toward her. And it really raises the question, well, notice he goes on to say, my hour has not yet come. Now, this is just at the outset of John's gospel, so we're going to want to trace this as we go through. But Jesus is going to talk several times about his time or his hour. And just to give you a preview, there'll be 2 or 3 instances, I think about 4, before we get up to chapter 13 where we come to his crucifixion, and he's saying, my time has not yet come. The hour is not yet. And then suddenly he says, now the hour has come. Now the time has come. Well, what would that kind of language suggest about what Jesus does, about his actions? If you heard someone talking about, well, you know, it's not time for that yet. Okay, not random. Okay, not random, a plan, Sandy says. I think that's exactly right. So what Jesus is indicating here, and he will do so further as we go along, is that there's a timetable to what he's accomplishing. There is a plan in place. It's not just random. He's not just going helter-skelter about his work. And yet this is what he tells her, my hour has not yet come. So this might seem a little bit abrupt. he does answer to her, and notice how she responds. His mother said to the servants, do whatever else he tells you. And I said here, everything else is subordinate.
There seems to be some understanding between Jesus and his mother. They both understand his purpose.
Okay.
Maybe she was, like so many mothers, eager to see her son accomplish his success or whatever.
Okay.
I mean, we're just reading so much.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we don't have anything to just base this on other than other instances in which he does use a similar terminology.
So, you can kind of see his reticence to say, well, my hour hasn't come, but once it starts, it's at the inevitability of the end.
Okay, all right. So the comment here that, this time has now begun. He's moving forward. This is the start of his ministry. And we're going to see many other signs that he works. So this is the first of those. And would there have been a need on the part of his family and others around him to understand that kind of thing? In other words, would that have been entirely clear to them from the get-go? I don't think so. Would they have known already that there might be something special about him? The disciples that listened to him when he was, around John, they certainly would have thought that. That's why they're following him. And
Expectation, he is the Messiah, is more political and military in their minds.
okay,
That's not the way his kingdom would be established.
okay. So there's great expectation among the people, and at times, maybe in the other Gospels, it's brought out more that Jesus is very careful not to fuel those expectations. There'll be an occasion in John 6 where he turns down this. I mean, they try to take him by force and make him king. So yeah, all that's involved. Ed? Yeah, okay. So he actually does. Okay, all right. Yeah, this wasn't an instruction just to go get some wine, that maybe she had an expectation that he could help in some way. But again, we're not told all the background, we're just given a few details here. But let me add this with that comment that I had earlier, everything else is subordinate to what he has come to do. That does seem to underlie this exchange between them. Do we have any other occasions in any of the Gospels where there might have been a certain expectation on the part of his family, and Jesus made it clear that he's really come to do something in terms of a spiritual purpose? Can you think of one other occasion at least where that kind of thing happens? Okay, yeah, in John 7, we're going to see there's one case where, in fact, they say, you need to go up to Jerusalem and show them your signs. And we have some indication that they didn't believe him from the start. Sandy, what were you going to? And Sandy brings up the time where they, his mother and brethren come to him and they're outside and they can't get inside. And somebody says, oh, your brethren are out there. And what's he say? He says, behold, my brethren, kind of like, these are my brethren. And to me, that kind of compares to this instance where he's making it clear that, yes, he's not denying that relationship, but he's saying there's something more important than that. And the other things are of lesser importance. Not that they're unimportant. He certainly shows concern for his family. But that seems to me what we've got here is this focus on the part of Jesus about what he has come to do. And so he's not going to just work a miracle, because a miracle would be impressive. Ed, did you have a point there? Yeah, exactly. The very last sign that John will record before Jesus' resurrection is the raising of Lazarus. And there was an expectation that Jesus would come sooner and not allow Lazarus to die. Okay, so you've got a human time frame, you've got a divine time frame. Well, let's go on. And notice the sign itself. We're told there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification. The stone was considered better than the earthenware, the pottery that was made, because it's indicated in the book of Leviticus, for instance, that maybe there's not as much need to purify them. So for whatever reason, they have these stone jars. We're told how much they hold, 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus tells his servants, fill the jars with water. They fill them to the brim. What's noteworthy about filling it to the brim? Okay, they're going to fill them all the way to the top. It's not like we're going to fill them part way and then something else happened in between. Filled to the top. And so let me read the rest of that. He said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. They take it, and it says the master of the feast tasted the water now become wine. He didn't know where it had come from, but the servants knew. So John is giving us some details that indicate that there's no sleight of hand here. He fills it to the brim. The servants know where the water's coming from. It's taken to the man that's in charge. And immediately, what does he say about this wine? It's high quality. It's the best that we've got. You have kept the good wine until now. So that's the sign. He tastes it. Presumably, the rest of the people drink it. And who could have done such a thing? Jesus, as the Son of God, is able to do this. So he shows his ability, his power over time. There wasn't this process of time during which the wine was created. It was instantaneously made. And the quality is very high, as it says. And so we're told this is the first of his signs that he did at Cana of Galilee, so a repetition of where he was when he does this. And notice it says he manifested his glory. So what's that about? He manifests his glory. What is his glory? Okay. Yeah, it's showing who he is, the position that he holds, his exaltation. He's able to do a sign that no one else would have been able to do. And it's a little bit reminiscent of chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Now, I've always read that and thought of, well, Jesus in the flesh. And that would certainly manifest his glory. In addition, though, the fact that he could work a sign, a miraculous sign such as this, would also be a manifestation of his glory. So my point is, here are those themes that John has introduced in chapter 1, and they're part of the accounts as we go forward. In addition to which it says, and his disciples believed him. What does that indicate? And think about John's purpose. What's John trying to do with these signs as he records them? That's part of the slides I was missing. Chapter 20, 30, and 31. What's the purpose of the signs? To produce what? Belief. Based upon testimony. Well, here is an indication that these disciples saw, and they were convinced by what they saw from the very start of his ministry. All right, and then we're told he goes down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, his disciples. They stayed there for a few days. Now, let me just suggest a couple of other things. We talked about the importance of a wedding. And, you know, the Holy Spirit, in giving us this record, is selective in the signs that he chooses. Why a sign about a wedding and turning water to wine? Well, it was impressive. This is the only such sign like this that we know of. Not that he didn't do it on other occasions, but this is the only one where we're told. But there is a background in the Old Testament to the significance of wine. What do you suppose that is? What would wine denote? Think back to God promising the land to the children of Israel. And how would that land be described to indicate to them that this was something to be preferred? Flowing with milk and honey. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean when they went into the land there was milk cascading down the sides of the river falls? No. It means there was abundance, there was richness, there was a greatness that the land possessed that God had promised. And that's true of this term wine. Notice in Deuteronomy 7:13, Moses addressing the second generation getting ready to go in, it says, he will love you, bless you, and multiply you. Well, how so? He will also bless the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, your grain and wine, and your oil. So when you have an abundance of things like these, then God is blessing them. He's providing for them. And that's all based upon the land that he said he would give them. At the end of Deuteronomy, notice that Moses says, so Israel lived in safety, Jacob lived alone in a land of grain and wine. The idea is that God is providing for them. And notice, whose heavens drop down dew. So here is a land that God is taking care of. It's a very fertile land. It's been promised to them. And of course, it was always based, the blessing upon what? That they do what? What was their part? Obedience. Okay. And when they failed to obey, the opposite was going to take place. Here's one of the prophets. This is much later. And here is Hosea. And Hosea's wife was unfaithful to him. Notice how that's described in Hosea chapter 2. It says of his wife, she did not know that it was I who gave her what? The grain, the wine, and the oil, who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So I gave them all these wonderful possessions. They used them for an idol. And so he says, verse 9, I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season. So with that wine, with that grain, there is abundance. Without it, then they are experiencing this curse that God promised if they disobey. So there is great blessing, and the absence of that would indicate judgment. In Deuteronomy 28, part of the curses are, verse 39, and I just pinpointed that particular verse because it mentions wine. You shall plant vineyards and dress them, but you shall neither drink of the wine nor gather the grapes, for the worms shall eat them. And I mention this because I wouldn't think of that if I just read the terminology about wine. I wouldn't be thinking of those. But for them, that meant abundance. That meant things were plentiful, that God was providing for them, or that he wasn't providing for them because of their disobedience. The whole idea of feasting is in a similar vein. We talked about this wedding feast at Cana. This was a special occasion. Over in Isaiah 25, listen to what Isaiah says about this future feast that God has planned. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. Now, what kind of a feast does that promise to be? Luxurious, one I would want to sit at the table at. And God describes his future blessing as being this occasion when they can sit down at this table and enjoy these things. He adds in verse 8 that at that time he will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. So even future blessing is described in terms of this plentiful provision that God's going to make. And in Revelation, you have this indication of the feast that he describes there. Let us rejoice and exult, give him the glory, and the marriage of the Lamb has come, and the bride has made herself ready. So even the idea of a marriage between, in the Old Testament, it was God and his people. In the New Testament, who is the bridegroom? It's Jesus, the Son who is coming. We'll see that next week. And then Jesus told parables about being invited to this feast and taking part in the feast. And what happens to those who spurn the invitation? You know, they sent out an invitation for the feast, and some people just aren't interested at all. And so he says, go out and invite, whoever there is out there to come and take part. So that imagery has been used previously in the Old Testament. Jesus, in his parables, has used that kind of imagery. Here is a sign that John records for us that's coming right down that very pathway. The idea of being at a feast and Jesus providing what is necessary for this. So I'm simply pointing out that these are terms that would have had great meaning to them as far as what's happening here. Maybe more so than what we would think of it. Okay, let's look at the second part of this, Jesus cleansing the temple. So now he does go back to Jerusalem. The Passover is at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Some question about, how this cleansing fits in with the one that comes right at the end of his ministry. I personally don't see a problem in the fact that Jesus could have cleansed the temple twice. And if we've got this 3-year length of his ministry, he does it at the outset and then he does it again at the end. But that's maybe a discussion for another time. This was as Passover was coming about, and this takes place in the temple again. We know where the temple is. In fact, real quickly, here's the temple over in the northeast corner of Jerusalem, up there at the top right hand. And so that was a special place. Here are some models made of the temple. And the temple represents what? Pardon me? God's presence. So it's a place to come and worship. God's presence is there. And so what does the worship and God's presence have to do with each other? Okay, God's not going to dwell there if you're disobeying him, and that's why they'd gone away into captivity. We just studied that. We spent a whole quarter studying that. Coming to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices was an indication of what on the part of the worshiper? Why did they come to Passover in Jerusalem? Why did they come to those other feasts? That's the place God appointed. That's where the temple was. What would the hope of the worshiper be by offering that sacrifice to God in the place that God commanded it to be done? What's the connection? Pardon me? Yeah, be blessed. I want to have a relationship with God. I want to do his will. So as I offer those sacrifices, he enables me to be in his presence. Now, not directly like the priests were, but to offer this sacrifice. The sacrifice atones for my sin. I can have fellowship with him. The point being, this was a big deal. So Jesus has come to the Passover. in Jerusalem. But he's not thrilled about what's happening, because you've got animals being sold and money changers whose role is to take foreign currency, just like it happens today, take foreign currency and change it into the currency that they use there so that they could do what they needed to, such as pay the temple tax, other things they might do. Jesus is displeased. What are we to make of that? It says he makes a whip of cords, he drives them out of the temple, pours out the coins, overturns their tables, and he says, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. Was it wrong for them to sell animals for sacrifices? Probably a lot of the people came from far away, and instead of carrying an animal with them the whole way, they might purchase the animal once they got to Jerusalem. And they might need to change their money in order to do what they needed to do. So, okay. All right. I think that's what Jesus is getting at. Sandy says it became a physical thing. In other words, to buy an animal or to change currency was not necessarily wrong, but to make everything about these things was to commercialize the whole process. And that's what Jesus is getting at. He says, do not make my Father's house a house of trade. At the close of the Old Testament that we just studied, remember Nehemiah getting upset because the people, instead of observing the Sabbath, on the Sabbath day, they were coming in and out. They were selling their wares. And he says, you're not honoring God by doing this. The same thing seems to be taking place here. And Jesus speaks out against it. And then verse 17 tells us his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. So Psalm 69 talks about someone being consumed with a zeal for God. And I'm sure they were impressed at this point in time, but they must have been impressed later when they realized why Jesus had done what he did. What does all of that have to do, again, with the coming of the Messiah? How does this fit in? Jesus coming in and casting these individuals out of the temple. Well, I'll ask that question. Let's go on. I think the next part relates to it. So the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Interesting question. And really, by asking the question, what are they asking? Yeah, by what authority? And that matches with that final cleansing where they said, by what authority are you doing these things? And they were talking about his cleansing the temple. Jesus answers, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. How did they interpret that? Yeah, literally. Yeah, they think maybe he's going to destroy the temple and then he'll raise it up. He was later quoted as having said that at his trial, and that's not what he said. He said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They misunderstood. They thought he was talking about the literal temple. It's taken 46 years to build this temple. Herod the Great had taken it upon himself to refurbish the temple. When the people came back from captivity, they built the temple a second time, but Herod was a great builder during his reign. He built a lot of different things. And one of the projects he took on was to redo the temple. At this point in time, he's already spent 46 years refurbishing the temple. And they're incredulous when Jesus says, if you destroy it, in 3 days I will raise this up. And of course, Jesus was not talking about the physical structure. He was talking about, verse 22 to 21, the temple of his body. Now, why would he have been saying that? Was he just trying to throw them off guard here and saying, okay, I can get you here. I'll talk about the temple, which is my body, and you'll be thinking about this temple. He probably had a different thought in mind, didn't he?
Obviously, it would throw them off.
Okay.
Because their minds are turned really literal, but he's saying that's going to be the sign that shows you that I have the right to do it, is when I'm raised from the dead. That'll be the sign that shows, yes, you did have the authority to do this.
Okay, all right.
But that's going to be way in the future, so I think it's a combination.
Okay.
Obviously, talking at the temple, cleansing the temple, and then he says, destroy this temple. So I think he intentionally did hide some things, like he spoke in parables.
Okay.
With the people who, were not really wanting the message, wouldn't see it.
All right, so Sandy suggests maybe it is a combination, that there's a sense in which he is speaking in a veiled way about the temple, but then he is highlighting the spiritual implication, which is his body is the temple. And think of how that works in a practical way. As we said a moment ago, the temple was a physical structure to which the children of Israel would come and offer their sacrifices in order to have fellowship with God, be in relationship with him. What was the destruction of Jesus' body? Was it not the very sacrifice by which all men could now be in fellowship with God? So he's indicating that there's something much greater occurring than just the temple. The temple was wonderful and it was great, but he had come to fulfill what the temple represented. And that was true fellowship with God through the sacrifice of himself. Okay, we're almost out of time. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. It had a greater impact after the fact, which is understandable, that they appreciated what he said 3 years before, after the fact. So in verses 23 to 25, we'll close here. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. Again, what's John's thesis? That if you hear the evidence about what Jesus did, you can be convinced that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. And there are those who believe on him. Is their belief complete? Is it all it needs to be? Not necessarily, but they're being convinced by what he does. Verse 24, Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Okay, so we'll leave it there and take up at chapter 3 next time. Thank you.